Out on the midnight, the world wants help.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kay Ramirez, and I am the Managing Director of StudyMove. Thank you so much for joining this session today. Today, we're going to talk about, let me just share my screen now. Yep, now you can see my screen now. Yep. Today, we're going to talk about fees, and it's great to connect with all of you. Greetings from Sydney. It's a beautiful day here in Sydney, as far as I can see from my window, of course. But it's great just to connect with all of you, and I appreciate the time that you are taking just to join this session. In the last couple of weeks, we received quite a few emails and a few phone calls from universities asking about the data that we collect and our analysis in regards to international fees. This is the time of the year when many Australian universities, they start working on the process of settling their fees for next year. So we thought it was a really good time just to put together this session and share with you basically the data that we have collected and the analysis that we have collected, just to have a little bit of perspective on what we expect it will be the pricing strategies that universities will follow next year. Of course, this data set will bring just a general perspective based on the data that we collect at StudyMove. And we're hoping that this information will help just to support your own individual and institutional strategies. We know that universities, they take a different approach in the area of pricing as many of areas. So we're hoping that this just brings a little bit of an additional analysis that will help you to support your strategies. And this is because we know, especially now in times of COVID, that pricing is such an important part of the marketing mix, and their actual overall marketing and recruitment strategies that is executed by universities just to engage with international applicants. And the disruption that is created or has been created by COVID-19 is making the settling of pricing even more complicated. We knew that has always been such a big challenge for universities. So the aim is just to help you and to put together some of the analysis and share some of our thoughts with all of you. So I hope you find this presentation useful. Now, in regards to pricing, it's important just probably to acknowledge that pricing is such an important part, not only from a marketing point of view, but also from a financial point of view. It's something that is crucial just for institutions just to reach their institutional goals and financial goals. So getting that setting of pricing correctly, it's very important. And we have been always been following as the sector the different market trends that exist. But now with COVID, obviously looking at those market trends is a little bit more complicated. And in 2022, when we expect, actually there are different expectations about 2022, putting together a pricing strategy, I think is gonna be even more challenging. And what we're actually gonna look is that we're actually not only gonna engage with one particular audience, we're gonna have different kind of markets or volatility in the markets, which I think is important that institutions will take that on board when they're actually planning ahead. And we're going to give you a lot of very interesting data that I think is going to assist you in taking that on board. And of course, when we think about pricing, especially for higher education, we need to acknowledge that different to other sectors or other companies, universities, they don't only price one or two or three different products. They actually have a large portfolios of programs, and settling the right pricing for each one of them, as I said, is quite challenging. But it seems that overall we have been doing a pretty good job. But now with COVID, we need to put an extra effort and look more closely into the data just to get it right. So this is all about that. This is just to giving you some additional data sets, additional information, and a different approach on how you can actually set your pricing, especially for next year. Now, we at StudyMove, we have been doing these key data sessions in the last 18 months. It's part of our new mission of the company. back in February 2020, we actually changed the mission of the company. And our aim has been in the last 18 months just to support the international education sector, putting data that we think is relevant, analysis that we think is relevant, really to support you through this very interesting and challenging period of disruption. And what we're going to do today is just taking some of the data that we have collected in the last 6 years. For some of you that don't know about us, that's a lot of the work that we do. We collect and analyze a lot of the data that we think is relevant for education, especially student recruitment and mobility strategies. We do this across all the Australian university sector, but also we do it with universities across the world. We do a lot of things with New Zealand as well, and with some European and American universities. And today, we're going to just take a slice of all this data that we are collecting, and we're going to look into what is, of course, the area of fees. In regards to fees, we have been collecting a large amount of data for the last 6 years. Especially in the last 3 years, we have been collecting more than 6,000 programs who are offered across all Australian universities to international students. And that's the data that you're gonna see. What you see on the screen at the moment is just a little bit of a sample of the data that is available if you want to purchase that data. Is a complete data set of fees. But also what we do is that for universities who want a more digested version of the data, we actually have just a more condensed report that provides some of the highlights, some of the position that universities have across the sector. And we, of course, make a lot of comparison by different discipline areas. So we can actually provide you more information about that if you're interested. But this is basically the data set that we actually are using today just to present some of the analyses that we are sharing with all of you. Okay? Now, in order to do this, we have been putting a lot of thought about it. And when we look at the data, we think that in order to understand how we're actually going to approach 2022, it's very important probably to understand what universities have been doing even before. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey of what we have seen universities have been doing from a data point of view before and during COVID-19. And we're also going to talk about not only fees, but the role of scholarships, which we know they have been a very important tool for universities in the last 18 months. And of course, something that we know is very important, which is the role of academic rankings, the World University Rankings, and what we expect it will be the role of these rankings also in 2022. We'll have time for question and answers, but if you don't want to ask a specific question now, of course, you will get all my contact details. This is a recorded version. Well, we're going to record this particular session, and we're actually going to share with you all the slides. So take your time, enjoy it, and we are hoping that this information is useful for you and your teams. Okay. All right, let's just start with how was the pricing strategy that we saw with universities before 2020? You know, the good old times before we had to deal with COVID. What is what we saw that universities were doing? And in order to do that, I have to say that we have seen that things have changed quite a bit in the last few years. And I'm talking about going back before 2020. So before 2020, universities were getting actually more, they were basically, we can see that they were taking a deeper analysis and taking a more deeply engagement in the way in which they're actually setting their fees. Now, not everybody, but quite a few universities, we noticed that that was the case. Because when we start collecting the data back in 2014, we identified that basically the approach to price your international tuition fees was basically looking into what we call just looking around your neighborhood. Back in 2014, 15, 16, even 17, it was very obvious that what universities were doing, it was just basically looking around on competitors around the state, and based on that, they were actually setting their fees. And I remember clearly that I had a conversation with somebody from a university in Victoria, and it happens in all the states, to be honest. basically saying, look, Kerry, I don't really think that I need your data because basically, look, here in Victoria, we know that University of Melbourne will have the higher fees. Maybe Victoria University will be in the lower range of fees. So we just need to kind of look around and see where we are across the middle. In New South Wales, I also have a conversation a few years ago with a university that said, look, we always set our fees probably 3 or 4% just below the University of Sydney, which we know is the highest one. So that was basically the approach that we had before. And back then, I'm talking about 5, 6 years ago, which, now with COVID seems that it was like a century ago, but it was just about 5 years ago. The logic was following what international students usually follow in terms of making their decision on where they're going to study. And back then, basically, we knew, and there was a lot of research into all this, students were actually first looking into or deciding which city they will be actually choosing as a study destination. And from there, they will look for which program it's available. And based on that, they will actually select the university. So it was a narrow approach and a more simple way for international students to decide where to study. So that close to your neighborhood approach make complete sense. But as information flows more effectively, especially using digital channels, students are actually broadening their perspectives. And they are not only looking for options just in one city, but they're actually looking at across all Australia, and sometimes, to be fair, across many other destinations. So we knew that universities, they need a more expanded view of what is the range of fees that exist. And for that reason, we know that a lot of universities have been using a lot of the data that we provide, and we get a lot of positive feedback in regards to that. For example, in 2019, we knew that on average, and this is on average, an annual international fee was about $32,000. But what it was very interesting, it was just to see the range of different options that we had here in Australia. And what you can see on the screen, every blue dot is the average international fee for undergraduate programs. That's the general approach. And as you can see here in Australia, we actually had a pretty healthy range of options. In fact, when we really start putting this data out there, we actually heard even some criticism saying, oh, we can't believe that the highest university with the highest fees is close to 50,000 when the lowest one is 25,000. So basically, with the price of one, you can actually get two from another university. So that's just outrageous. Well, in fact, it's actually a very healthy thing for the sector. This means that although it gets more complicated to analyze your pricing strategy, but as a sector, is allowing Australia just to have being able just from a pricing point of view, we're able now to reach different audiences. And when we are reaching actually so many international markets, it has been very healthy. And I think one of the great success of Australia, just to being able just to engage with different audiences that will fit to a different price range. And obviously, this price reflects in many, many cases some of the experiences that students are expecting or universities are offering. I'm saying this because we have done a similar kind of analysis from other countries, and we don't see this wider range, which obviously is limiting some sectors across the globe just to actually engage with a different audience. So that was a very interesting approach. And little by little, we have seen that more universities are looking, moving away from that close to your neighborhood approach and really look at a nationwide approach. Now, the other thing that it has been quite interesting when we follow the data is that we noticed that a lot of universities in Australia, and that happens also across many other countries, they were reviewing their fees probably every 2 or even 3 years. So basically, let's say they set in 2016 their fees for 2017, 18, and 19, and that's it. And then what happened is that when they reached 2019, to catch up with the market, they actually had to do big jumps. So we have seen that some universities who are not frequently reviewing their fees, they need to actually have big jumps in their actually adjustment of fees for following years. Now, that has changed quite a lot with COVID, as you will imagine. Now, we have seen that universities are more frequently reviewing that. But going back to that story and just to get some perspective, that's something that we have seen. So basically, what we have seen, and let me just, before I get into that, just to summarize, we are moving slightly away from that in your neighborhood approach. We're actually reviewing more frequently our fees in the sector. And the other thing that we noticed is that back in 2016, 17, 18, a lot of universities were having like a general approach about setting their fees. And they basically, they said, all our fees will go up 4 or 3% and so on. But some universities are actually being quite clever and effective in looking into more detail into the data. And now they're actually looking into which areas, for example, they could actually increase their fees. And this is basically by discipline areas. And this is the example that I'm sharing with you on the screen. This is basically the 2019 annual international average fee for a postgraduate program in creative arts. And we have seen this in many discipline areas. The story of this chart is that usually, as you will imagine, it was basically a group of 8 universities, the one who set their fees at a higher level. But we have seen that some universities are looking into those pockets, those areas where they, based on reputation or based on possibly growth of demand, they can actually have and set a higher fees and be on the mark to what the students are expecting in one hand, basically their marketing position, but also with that generating additional revenue because you have an additional fee. As you can see, this is the example of, for example, in this particular discipline area, you can see Macquarie ranked number 3, University of UTS number 5, even University of Newcastle in number 7. So those universities, they have seen and they have gone through the lengths of looking into the data in more detail just to find those opportunities. And I'm saying this because I think that's kind of the mindset that we should actually take for 2022. I think it's going to be important just to make the effort to look into more detail and see where you actually fit instead of just having this general approach. We'll get that in a minute, but I just want to give you that example as some universities that already before COVID were doing that, and they were doing actually quite well. Now, another thing that we noticed even before COVID, and you all know all about this, is the role of rankings. We knew for many years that it was some sort of a relationship between the ranking that a university will have and the fees of that university. But back in 2018, we thought it was time just to really look into detail and see the number or the clear relationship or not that exists into this. And we actually look into the data that is collected by StudyMove, and we actually correlate that in different ranking systems. And we actually have seen that, for quite a few years, that correlation is very clear and a really important parameter for universities to set their rankings. That's the chart that you can see on the screen now. You can see that in one hand, we have the QS World University Rankings, and in the other side, we actually have the average international fee. And as you can see, the higher your ranking it is, the higher it has been the average fees that universities are actually setting. And we have seen that this relationship has been very, very strong. We are talking about very strong correlations since 2016. That's the first time we did it. And we have seen that that relationship is getting stronger and stronger. In the last 5-6 years, we have seen correlations above 0.80, which means it's a very strong correlation. Now, the question that we all have is how that's going to play in times of COVID and how that actually has changed in time of COVID. And that's exactly where we are heading now. So just to summarize, and I should mention also that we also have a report that basically shows that data set. We actually give you that relationship between rankings and fees. So if you're interested to learn more about, just send us an email and we'll send you more information about it. But basically what we saw before COVID, it was that statewide comparisons, it was the starting points, and little by little universities are looking into a broader horizon. The review of fees has been more frequent, but although not everybody is doing that, but that's what we have been seeing. This general approach just to increase fees in some cases has been taken away, and universities are looking into more detail into how they can actually get some gains by particular field of the study where they actually see stronger demand. And of course, the role of ranking has been very dominant in the way universities were actually setting their fees. Now, I thought it was important just to take that history lesson and that journey just to put perspective into what happened when COVID hit. And, COVID arrived. It was February 2020. We didn't know what it was coming, but it arrived and it created a massive, massive disruption in the sector. And the timing for fees was kind of like odd in terms of COVID, because when COVID arrived in March 2020, all the fees for 2020 were already set. That's it. In fact, we actually had students who enroll into our programs without dealing with COVID necessarily in February. So what we thought it would be interesting is to see what happened in 2021, and I will take you through that in a minute. But definitely we know that the impact of COVID has been huge in the sector, and that's going to influence and has influenced the way in which universities are setting their fees. We don't have that strong demand that we experienced in the last few years. As you can see on the chart, you can see the number of international student commencements since 2013 and the latest figures that we have for 2021. And after years and years of years, 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 of healthy growth, which make the analysis of fees in a way a little bit easier, then in 2020, we went down, and then 21 went down. At the moment, we're about 22% less in commencements, which is new students, in comparison to 2020. But when we go to pre-pandemic levels, we're about 30% down, which is huge. So that's creating a lot of disruption. That's creating a lot of noise. And of course, one of the problems of COVID is this uncertainty. We keep putting plans ahead, and all these plans have been canceled. So how we can actually move forward is going to be quite complicated, but also important, because in 2022, we expect that we'll have a very different environment. So what we did back in 2020, this is going back in September 2020, is that we actually figured out and trying to estimate what it was going to happen in 2021. So I'm going back to, I think this actually was a webinar that we put together, I think September, October 2020. So COVID was bad, but not as bad as it is now. And we figured out some scenarios, and I'm going to take you through what happened in 2021. So back in 2021, we thought, okay, I'm sure that it will be some universities that, due to the large amount of disruption that we have, basically they're going to say, look, next year, I'm not going to increase my fees. I'm just going to show to support to the market. I'm actually going to use this as a statement to the market of saying to students, look, I'm not increasing the fees. Things are really, really complicated. So that's what is going to happen, okay? Then we thought that another group of universities will follow some of the historical average growth and probably have a small increase of 3 and 4%, because basically, they're probably, they thought that there was no need just to make this no increase statement, and they will actually just follow what they have done in the past. But also because, back in 2020, we already had financial constraints. So universities will be trying just to get some of the gains and trying just to bring some of resources back into their operations. And of course, we thought probably would be a small group of universities that could be, first of all, more optimistic about 2021, or because they really need additional resources, they will actually increase their fees even more. And because they have a large number of continuing students, as a result of increasing those fees, maybe you will actually get some financial gains. So that's basically the three scenarios that we put together. Once again, this is back in September 2020, thinking about 2021. And I'm just going to tell you what happened and what the data is telling us in terms of what was the reaction in 2021. And I think this is important, so we actually think about what's going to be the reaction for next year. Okay? So what we saw that happened, and this is using the StudyMove data set that basically is one of the most comprehensive, if not the most comprehensive that you can find at the moment. What we identified was this. First, when we saw the increase in fees, back in 2018, 2019, and even 2020, we actually had some important, I will say, growth on their fees. And this is because, as I showed you before, we actually had a very healthy market. The number of international student commencements and enrollments were growing. Things were actually looking good. So I think that gave some confidence to universities to increase their fees as a result of a higher demand that came from international applicants. Now, 2020 was an interesting. We saw that even then, and let's just remember what happened at the end of 2019, it was a lot of talk and analysis in the sector that some of the main markets like China, they were going to slow down. This is before COVID, we were already talking about that. So we already noticed that a few universities were trying just to put the brakes into their fees. So that's why it was 4.6 and not probably even further. Now, 2021, as you will expect, it was absolutely putting the brakes on everything. When COVID came, we actually didn't know what to do. That's completely understandable. Massive level of disruption, big problems with the attracting international applicants, borders completely closing. So the reaction of the majority of universities was, let's just leave the fees now as they are, and let's probably worry about that a little bit later. And that's why the 2022 strategy is going to be very, very important for everybody. Now, when we look into the detail, this is the in aggregate what the sector and what the fees actually were looking year by year. When we look at the sector, it's interesting just to see how each university react. And this is the chart that you can see now on the screen. Each bar that you see on the screen is the annual increase of average fees. This is for undergraduate. And I'm using undergraduate as many of the examples, but for postgraduate, pretty much was the same trend. And as you can see, a large amount of universities, 19 of them, they decide either to decrease or not to increase their fees. A few universities actually, they said, look, I'm just gonna actually decrease my fees. I think that will be too high in comparison to what the market is expecting. In some cases, I have to say that the decrease on the average fees was the result also of some universities cutting some of the programs that they actually were too high. So as a result of that, your average will go actually low and end up to be a decrease. Or because students were unable just to come to Australia and not offering some of those programs, which were actually on a higher fees, end up to be an average decrease in comparison to what happened last year. So it's 19 of them. So pretty much half of universities were like, I'm not increasing, or I'm actually just small increments in comparison to the last year. Now, 12 universities actually had a small increase between 2 or 4%, which it's minimal, it's reasonable. It's probably following some of the financial requirements that institutions have, and thinking that probably a 2 or 4% increase is something that the market, even in 2021, will be already engaging and you'll be okay with it. Now, it was just very few, 4 universities who actually increase their fees. And when we look into this group of 4, we actually identified that I think 3 out of them were universities who haven't reviewed their fees in quite a few years, probably in 2 or 3 years. So they have to once again catch up. That's why this review of the fees more frequent, I think is going to be more important. So you don't have to expose yourself and actually in such a volatile market, have probably more difficulties because you need to catch up with the market, okay? So that's exactly what we saw. And that's basically the picture that it was painted in 2021. What we also know is that, and this is probably, this is for you. This is where we actually are at the moment. In terms of the average international fee, we moved from 33, nearly 34,000, that's the gray bar in 2020, just a small increment, it's about $300 in 2021. Postgraduate fees were actually quite interesting because we have seen also that postgraduate fees have been increasing a little bit more than undergrad. And this is because in the last few years, we actually had a very healthy increase in the demand for postgraduate education for international applicants here in Australia. That's why the bar is a little bit higher. And what it was quite interesting is that on average, actually that trend follow a little bit more than undergrad. So interesting just to see how things were different by study level. Now, just to complete the picture of 2021, this is once again the range of options or options that exist across all the university sector. That hasn't changed, and I don't think that will change. You know, we still have universities who will be setting their fees, even though it was not a big increment or no increment, but they will actually have a higher fees than the other ones. So that position or looking for be part of a position in the market across the sector remain in 2021. Okay. Now, the other thing that we identified that it was a very important and very active tool in regards to pricing in 2021, start at the end of 2020, but definitely has been something important in 2021 is the scholarships strategies. We identified that pretty much everybody, and we actually collect data on scholarships as well. We collect the data of all 40 Australian universities on scholarships. And we identified that pretty much every single university increased the offering of scholarships for new international students. And they expand some of that to some of the continuing students who were unable to return to their campus due to travel restrictions. Now, the comparative analysis of scholarship is a little bit more complicated because universities present their scholarships in different ways. Sometimes it's a fee discount that applies to everyone, sometimes not necessarily. But definitely we identified 20 universities who openly and directly said that they will offer scholarships to all students who are unable to travel and as a result of the restrictions created by COVID-19. And what I think is quite interesting, but also, to be honest, is just the result of such a challenging period and a very quick response just to the market under a very complicated situation, is that even on the scholarship side, we have seen that universities are actually also reacting in a very different way. And what you can see here on the chart is from those 20 that openly said this is a fee discount for everybody who is unable to travel to our campus, we're going to give you a discount. This is the result. And as you can see, you have one university that in 2021 offer 40%, some others that offer 30%, and even some in the other side of the scales just offering 15%. Now, I'm saying this because I think that in 2022, we're going to see that this kind of tool will remain because it's important for universities just to have that flexibility and understanding that when students are unable to travel and to have that full experience on campus, they're going to try to look for a particular discount. And I think it's just a very responsible thing to do, but also an effective way just to engage with the market. But what I think is quite interesting is just to see this range of different options in terms of a scholarship. 40%, I think, is really, really high when you see others probably on the 15. And maybe what we will see in 2022 is that these scholarships will remain, but probably universities will know better or how to actually introduce or more effectively use these scholarships in 2022. But as you can see, the picture of 2021 is that we actually had quite a wide range of scholarships or fee reductions across the sector. Okay. All right, so as a result of that, I took you through the journey of what happened before 2020, in 2020 and 2021. And it's interesting just to think what's going to happen in 2022. In 2022, we still are facing a lot of uncertainties. We still don't know what's going to happen. There is a great expectation, and I actually follow that expectation, that especially in the second half of the year, our borders will be a lot more open, definitely. We don't know at what stage will be in March. So for universities, it's going to be very important just to identify where those opportunities or what it will be the good strategy to follow in 2022, which is a very different scenario to 2021 when you think about it. Let me just go back. 2020, we didn't know what to expect. Fees were set, and bang, we get hit by COVID. 2021, we were like just swimming for survival, and we just react as best as we could. But I think 2022 is giving us that opportunity of being more strategic. And I just want to share with you some of the data and some of the thoughts that will actually, I think we're going to be useful just to support your pricing strategy based on what we have seen with the data. Okay. I think that the conditions of 2022 are actually showing us that something that is going to be a key element of pricing strategies in 2022 is price differentiation. This is because we don't know at what stage, first of all, students are going to be able to come back, but also we don't know what kind of students actually are going to be able just to come back. So being able just to be flexible in the way in which we actually manage our pricing strategy is going to be very crucial, because you don't want to be in a position of saying, you know what, I'm not going to increase my fees because it's too hard. And then suddenly in the second half of 2022, let's say it could be the case that we have completely open borders, and those students, if we experience high demand, that's another question, but if we experience high demand, maybe you are missing out because you did not set your fees high enough just to be in balance with that demand that we experienced in the second half of 2022. So being able just to have a flexible approach, I think that's the best possible scenario that we could actually follow. But, you know, I insist, this is just something that we see from the outside, and I'm sure you have your own views about it. But definitely let me just give you a few examples of where we see some sort of price differentiation opportunities for universities. For example, something that we know is that undergraduate programs, in fact, this is data coming from the Department of Education, is the undergraduate market has remained, you know, somehow is flat or at least steady since the start of COVID. This is the number of year-to-date March figures. So this is basically semester one for undergraduate, which is in 2020, we have 33,000 commencements in the sector. And then in 2021, even though we still have border closures, and even though students expect that the border closures will remain, we still have 30,000 students. And this is because it seems that some of the models that universities have put together with the idea of being hybrid, where you start online and then you will come transferring to campus a bit later, is actually getting some positive impact for the undergraduate market. Very different to what happened with the postgraduate market. In 2020, in March, this is probably just when COVID hit, we had 40,000. And then in 2022, it cut nearly in about 40%. Actually, I have the figure here. Yeah, 30%. So I think it's going to be important that if we are expecting that something similar will happen, at least in the first half of 2022, there is an opportunity for universities just to review and to think that market conditions are going to be different by study level. And this is when you can start thinking, what's going to be my pricing strategy for undergrad, which it will be very different to postgrad, because that's when we have seen that there is a challenge. In fact, in this conversation of are we losing market share against Canada and the UK, that still hard to understand. But what we know is that it will be probably the postgraduate market, the one that we're going to have some weaker demand, even in 2022. But what we know is that for undergrad, actually, the proposition that we are putting, even with border closure, is working. And if we start opening the borders in 2022, we think that we could actually experience that demand would actually grow. So I'm putting that for all of you But this is the kind of price differentiation strategies that we think will be effective for 2022. Now, the other one that is important is price differentiation by market. According to the plans from the Australian government, and I have to say, those plans are not just like an Australian kind of thing, is what nations around the world have been doing. When we reach 80% of the vaccination target, which I'm in Sydney, I'm in lockdown, that seems like decades away, but the reality is that's going to happen, and it's going to happen very, very soon. But we first of all know that some selected markets or some selected visitors are going to be able just to cross the border with lower restrictions, maybe not even quarantine. And what the Australian government has been telling us is that students or visitors from overseas who are fully vaccinated with things like Pfizer, Moderna, or AstraZeneca are actually going to be able just to more freely cross the borders in 2022. So for that reason, price differentiation also has to be looking into those markets or those students who more freely going to be able to come. Because although we expect that non-vaccinated international visitors or students who don't have those vaccines at this stage are going to require quarantine, we know that they're going to come, but probably going to be a softer demand from those particular markets. Now, the problem is that you have a market like Malaysia, for example, which is a top 5 market for higher education for Australia. And in Malaysia, there are actually 7 different vaccines who have been approved. So you could actually have a student who probably in Malaysia that got Pfizer, so it will be in the group 1 of students that will come. But you probably will have some students who they will still require a quarantine, or they will hesitate to go because they don't have those particular vaccines. So in order to do that, we still need to look for ways in which we can actually cater for everyone. And I think the way to move forward, of course, is with the actively use of scholarships, as you have been doing also in this year and a little bit of 2020. So we believe that as a result of that, scholarships will still play a role, but in a way that you can actually have a price differentiation by market, or not even by market, but pretty much by situation of each one of your applicants. Because you don't want to be in a position when you set a price and then you're going to have students from some of your top markets who are unable to come. And as a result of not having a scholarship just to really keep that engagement with them, you're actually going to lose into the opportunity just to engage with more international applicants. So that's the other one that I think we need to consider, because basically 2020, if I can summarize in a way, is going to be an evolving situation that is going to be very quickly changing. So we need to have those tools and those elements in the strategy just to flexibly keep the engagement with the student. And that's, of course, for the benefit of the institution, but also for the benefit of our applicants who have been engaging or waiting for this for quite a long time. Now, on that, going back also to the green group, the selected markets where there are a lot of students from Pfizer and vaccine, I really just want to take a moment on something that we have forgotten from the last couple of years, which is the study abroad, semester abroad market. Those are actually students who come from mainly North America, the US and Canada, and from Europe. And I'm going back probably 6-7 years ago, but study abroad markets or study abroad students, probably it was a point when they represent 25% of our students in our university sector. In places like New Zealand, for example, it was about 50% of the students who were study abroad students. And they were a very important part of the revenue that universities receive from international students. And just to put it in perspective, it seems that we have forgot about study abroad fees. We have actually haven't seen any changes in study abroad fees since 2019. This is the average study abroad fees per semester is about $10,000. And in some universities, actually, they left their fees there because they thought, well, nobody's going to come to do a semester abroad fee. They were at $6,500 per semester. So don't forget about that, because they are the first group that most likely going to be able just to come, because they are the ones who, based on the plan that the Australian government outlined, They have the vaccines just to come freely and through the border in 2022. And just to put it in perspective, you will probably think, oh, well, how many are those students? Well, back in 2019, using figures from the Department of Education, they did a pretty good analysis on how many actually study abroad fee-paying students. There were 14,000 study abroad students in 2019. Let's say that they pay about $10,000 per program. So that means that we're actually talking about a $140 million market that I think it will be a mistake and a missed opportunity if we forget about that. And here the key is also spend some time in reviewing those fees because, as I said, and makes complete sense. It has been such a big disruption, the one that we had in the last 2 years, that we focus on many, many of things, but spend some time actually looking into that because I think it will be some interesting opportunities for universities in the study abroad market, especially in the first half of the year when we're still going to be dealing with some uncertainties. So just put that probably as a note. Yeah? So what we think, and still, this is a big question, it will happen also in terms of rankings, is that we think that rankings will remain important. And I'm saying this because it has been a lot of conversations in 2020, since 2020, about, oh, rankings are going to drop for Australia. They're not going to do very well. Well, 2020 and 2021 actually were one of the best ranking results for the Australian university system. And in fact, it's true, the correlation that exists is not as high as what we had previously. You can see the chart there, but correlations above 0.80 are still very, very, very high. Like anybody will basically tell you, yep, there's two variables with a correlation of 0.80. It's very strong correlation that exists. So don't forget about that. I think that this is going to still play an important parameter, and that's going to bring the differentiations. And the students are going to still looking into the ranking system just to have make their decision and to probably have an understanding of where is this perception of where university sits in the whole university sector. Now, what I think is important about rankings is two things. First of all, for the first time, we actually look into the employability rankings. QS actually has some employability rankings based on what companies around the world and actually graduates around the world are talking about universities. And we also look into the correlation that exists in that employability side of things. We think employability is going to be a big thing also in 2020, 2023. It's not only about the research or the academic reputation of a university, but also from a student point of view is, okay, I'm going to be employable or not. Well, also in employability, we identify a correlation of 0.79, which is also strong. So look into those ranking of employability also as part of your strategies and see where you are and see what actually can be expected from a pricing point of view. But also, something that we have done, and it's part of our report, is just not only to look at the overall ranking system. I think it's important to really look into the different discipline areas. And the universities who are actually getting our reports, they really like just to see the differences that exist. And that's when you can actually identify some particular gains that you may have in 2022 by discipline areas, because not every single discipline area has a strong correlation. This is just drilling into the detail of the data, but I think that's what we need for 2022. As you can see, in some cases, the correlation was weak or moderate, and I'm gonna give you an example of that. We actually look at the rankings for nursing programs, and we haven't been able to identify a close relationship between the ranking that a university has in nursing and their fees. And I think that's a good example because I think international applicants and universities know that students are not necessarily driven when they're applying for a nursing program on the ranking that exists for that university or that discipline. They're looking for the qualification. They're looking for maybe the employability side of things. They're looking for other things. So what we actually are providing with our reports is just to give you access to that particular set of data that really, really help you just to have a better understanding of what could be the best way to engage from a pricing point of view with international applicants. And that's when we actually think that things are going in 2022. I think that the use of data will be vital just to understand not the general approach, not the general trend, but where are the details, where are those areas where you can actually be more effective? Because 2022, although we expect that it will be a much better year, like anything can be better than 2021, but the reality is that with border closures easing, it'll be important just to look into data and having access to the data. And our clients are really, really enjoying just to have access to look at the data, so where they can actually make decisions based on that and look at the detail on what can actually be done as well. And look for those price differentiation strategies in terms of looking at what markets actually we're expecting that will have probably a stronger demand than others. Like the study abroad market is something that we think is going to actually grow quite significantly in 2020. But also we're going to have some soft, unfortunately, markets like the postgraduate market, especially in the first half of the year. So look into those details. And I think once again, the data is going to be very useful for doing that. Scholarships as a part of your price differentiation, I think is going to be very important, but finding that right scholarship, I think that's what is key. And once again, this is when we have a scholarship report that universities have been using quite a bit, and it has been very useful just to understand that as well. And finally, don't forget about that rankings will remain important, I think, in 2022. So what you can see is that we are heading into a very interesting 2022. We just hope that this very quick presentation helps you just to have a little bit of an outlook of what could happen or what may not happen. And if you want more information, please contact us. I actually have a link here where you can actually see information about the different reports that we have. I'm going to put it on the chat just there, and hoping that that's useful for all of you. I think I just have a few minutes for questions. Let me just stop now.